in. So today, like I mentioned, we'll be talking about cars. Okay. So this is a section that I feel a lot of people have trouble studying for, and while others have a pretty easy time with. So depends. Before we get started, in case this is your first lecture with me, my name is Mark Abdurrahmanov. I'm a graduate from Stony Brook University. I have a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry. My MCAT date was this January, the 16th. So only a couple months ago, and I scored a 520. And with my score breakdown, so you can see I scored a 132, a perfect score on cars. Okay. So I also want to talk about this course that we have. So it's a 15-week full course, and it says starts next week. That is this week. 3 lectures per week, Thursday, Friday, and Saturdays. This is the Saturday lecture. 1 office hours per week for now. Sundays, which is tomorrow at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but the day and the amount of office hours may change. We will cover most of the highest yield MCAT content, and all lectures will begin at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Okay. This is the link for our GroupMe. GroupMe will have all the lecture recording links and PowerPoints posted. We'll also be posting any updates or changes to scheduling here, and it's just an easy way to get a hold of me or Tim or any of the other tutors. Sorry about that. Okay, so learning objectives. So today we'll really be focusing on the main idea and understanding the passage in cars, okay? So sorry about that. The key to that, I think, is understanding the main idea of the passage and how the author supports the main idea and what conclusions we can draw about it, okay? And that's what we'll be really focusing on today. All right, so let's move on to the content. So how do we identify the main idea of a passage? So the fundamental question you should ask yourself whenever you start reading a new cars passage is, what is the author's purpose for writing this passage? They're not just writing it because they felt like writing. They have a specific goal, okay? The author will always have a main purpose, which they will make sure to weave in into every part of the passage, okay? So what are some common main ideas that the author could have? Well, some very common ones are they trying to praise something or criticize something? Are they maybe comparing two things? If so, do they have a preference between these two things? Are they saying one of these two similar ideas or things is better or worse than the other? Are they arguing for or against something? Do they have a specific stance on a topic? Are they simply describing something or trying to educate the audience about something that they either know about or have an interest in, right? These are all common ideas that a passage could have, right? And more than likely, most passages you'll see will have one of these ideas. But as you can see, these are very vague outlines, right? So let's go in a little bit more detail. So I mentioned a lot of something, right? So what is this something? Well, that's what you have, sorry. That's what you also have to figure out. So is this something a person? Is it maybe multiple people? Are they talking about people in history? So say political leaders, leaders throughout history, any particular artists or philosophers, mathematicians, anything like that? Are they maybe praising or criticizing this person or this group of people? Are multiple different people being compared? Are they comparing 2 different philosophers? Are they comparing 2 different mathematicians or something like that? And again, do they have a preference of one over the other? Do they maybe like one historical leader over another? Okay. Maybe this something is a book or article or theory that someone expressed. So this may be different from the person. So the person could be maybe Einstein, and they're talking about Einstein and his life and his accomplishments. And that could be fall into the first category of, is it a person? If they're more talking about a specific theory that Einstein had or a specific idea he expressed or a book he wrote, then it would fall more under the second category, where they're not specifically talking about Einstein himself or his life, but rather this one particular work that he did or this one theory that he had. Okay, And this is a very important distinction, and they'll try and trip you up with this on the MCAT. They'll always have, like, if they ask you, like, what is the main idea of the passage, they'll have something, if it's talking about Einstein's like book or theory, they may have the main idea is about his life or something like that, or about him as a person, and that would be the wrong answer. It would be something that's specifically related to his work rather than his life or who he is as a person. So when talking about this book, article, theory, or idea, does the author disagree with this person? Do they agree? Maybe it's a mix of both. Maybe they like some parts of the idea, but they want to expand on it. Or maybe they want to actually do the opposite. They want to go back a little bit. They think the original theorist went too far. Okay? Are they maybe comparing two different theories or ideas? Are they comparing maybe Einstein's theory with, I don't know, Newton's theories or something like that? Are they comparing two different theories or ideas? And again, this is different than comparing two different people. It's the work specifically. You have to look at, are they talking about the person themselves, or are they talking about a specific work that that person produced, either art, a book, a theory, an idea, something. Okay. Maybe, and the third category is maybe this something is a new technology, right? They could be comparing it to an older or a previous technology. They could be comparing it to alternative modern technology, so something that's slightly different but accomplishes the same task in a different way. Do they like, and usually they'll say, do they like this new technology or do they not like it? Are they pro or against it, right? Do they think it's better than the older version or the modern alternatives? Do they think it's worse? Do they think it has a potential for improvement in the future, or do they think it's like a dead end, right? So these are the three main categories that I think most articles will be about. And again, these are fairly vague, and it's up to you to fill in which category it belongs in. But what I'm trying to get at with these two slides is when you're reading a passage, you want to be able to categorize the passage into specific bullet points, right? What is the subject? What is the something? Category 1, person. Category 2, theory or idea or something that a person, or some kind of work made by a person. Or 3, it's a new technology, right? Or it could be another one, right? And then I also want you to think about this common main ideas. Now that you have the subject, what are they trying to say about this specific subject, okay? Any questions so far? Okay. And for cars, I really think that the best way to improve in cars is to actually practice, and more than anything, practice right. Okay. So for this lecture, I'll be having a lot of practice passages and practice questions to try and kind of get you to get into that habit, while also looking at it through maybe this lens that at least I used. And I know a lot of other books also suggest it. A lot of other sources and books also suggest this lens, and maybe try and approach a passage from this specific way to see if you can more understand the passage rather than just try and like not even understand, like try and answer the questions that has come with the passage, but understand the passage first. Once you do that, then I think answering the questions becomes a whole lot easier. Okay, like I mentioned, and I'll put this again in the chat. So I have practice passage links. So I'll post it again for anybody else that recently joined here. If you go to there, it has 2 passages on it. These are practice passages. In a second, we'll be looking at practice passage 1. I'll give you guys about 10 minutes, which is how long you should take on the real MCAT to read it. Maybe I'll give you a couple more minutes extra just because this is practice. But I want you to try and read it. And again, focus on this lens that I talked about with try and understand what the main idea of passage 1 is, what it's talking about, what the subject is, what the author is trying to get at, and what he's focusing on about the subject, okay? And it'll also be right here on screen in the Zoom link. It's a little bit small here, so it's a bit harder to read, but if you want to like highlight stuff as you go, then please go to the Google Doc that I put in the chat. You'll be able to download the file as a Word document and then highlight as you see fit and do all that. Okay, so I will give you 10, sorry about that, 10 minutes until 8:57, let's say. Yeah, so please start reading. This would be the first poll question. And again, this really ties into what we were talking about. What is the primary purpose? What is the main idea of the passage?
Yep. So we have 43% saying A and 57% saying C.
Okay. So most people chose C with some going A. Well, correct answer is A, and I'm glad that at least half of you were able to get it right. Most of you were able to kind of get to that point. All right, so let's go over it. Why is it A and why is it not C? Well, so A is articulate and defend a contractarian view of justice, okay, whereas C is compare the utilitarian and contractarian theories of justice. Well, let's go back to the passage and let's see. Well, like I mentioned, the main idea is something that the author will always try and weave back into the passage. So he'll constantly be mentioning it. Everything will basically tie back into it, right? Well, he mentions utilitarianism here in the first paragraph where he says two important concepts are this and notion of social contract, right? So he introduces two different ideas, two different philosophies, right? However, if you notice, really, he doesn't talk about utilitarianism again for pretty much most of the passage, right? This has nothing really about utilitarianism, neither does this, neither does this. And then I believe he mentions it again somewhere here, but very, very briefly. And again, nothing really about it. So 4 of the 5 paragraphs don't really have anything regarding utilitarianism. They almost exclusively focus only on contractarianism, right? So that kind of rules out utilitarianism as part of the main idea, as one of the subjects, right? So the subject could be one idea or it could be 2 ideas that he could be comparing and contrasting. I wouldn't really say he's comparing and contrasting 2 different ideas because he doesn't really talk about both of them that much. He only talks about one of them. The other, he just mentions that it exists, but he doesn't talk about many of its tenets or how it compares to contractarianism or how it differs or maybe how one may be better than the other or something like that, right? Mostly he just talks about one. So that's why I think C can't be the right answer. Whereas A, articulate and defend a contractarian view of justice. Well, we can see, like I mentioned, almost the entire passage is solely about contractarianism and just explaining it, the different processes and different evolutions it went throughout history with John Rawls. And also, but we want to get to the main point. What is his purpose? he's trying to praise it, he's trying to defend it. And remember, that was one of my main ideas that I said is very common. Praising or kind of telling the benefits or defending a certain idea. Well, how do you know that he's defending it rather than just describing it? Well, he, in this last paragraph, so before he's talking about just describing it, well, here he says, while it can be and has been argued that the blind choosers envisioned by new contractarians might well decide to gamble on the outcome, such arguments are ultimately lacking in interest, right? So what does he do here? He describes contractarianism, then he describes a counter argument that many would say could oppose contractarianism and go against it. But instead of just leaving it as that, he then himself refutes that kind of criticism, contractarianism, by saying such arguments are ultimately lacking in interest. So arguing against contractarianism, specifically this argument, is ultimately lacking, right? That's how you know that he's defending something, right? Because if you're just describing something, you would maybe give its pros and then a couple of cons, or maybe any criticisms or anything like that, if you're just kind of a neutral observer. Whereas if you were defending it or praising it, you would try and shoot down any criticisms and only speak about its virtues, right? And that's what he's doing here. So the way I would read this passage to get that, so as I would read through this first paragraph, I would maybe think that, okay, he is comparing utilitarianism and contractarianism. That would be my first thought upon reaching the end of this first paragraph. Once I read this second paragraph, I kind of shy away from that because I believe that he hasn't talked about utilitarianism in this paragraph, so I would kind of shy away from that, and I would say he's describing contractarianism. Again, these two paragraphs would kind of confirm in my mind, and this is just as I'm reading it, would kind of confirm in my mind that he's not talking about utilitarianism, so it can't be a compare and contrast. It has to be a description, right? Then finally, once I get to this last paragraph, I would see that he makes this common criticism and then tries to refute it. And that would kind of give me the hint that he's not only describing contractarianism, but he's also defending it and praising it, and he considers it very correct. Okay. Okay. And that's how we get A. So it articulates, which describes and defends or praises a contractarian view, right? And nobody picked this, but just to go over it, B, propose a radical solution. He's not really proposing a solution. And he even says in the last paragraph, contractarianism is not practical because it can't practically be done. It's only theoretical, and it's more of a theoretical basis of philosophy. And D, examine advantages and disadvantages of Rawls' theory. Rawls' theory is a part of his passage, but it's a small part. Mostly he's talking about contractarianism as a whole, and Rawls' theory is only a small part of it. And he doesn't really talk necessarily about the disadvantages of Rawls' theory, only the advantages. So in that sense, it wouldn't be D because it's not advantages and disadvantages. And also D is more of a sub point rather than a main idea. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody have any questions about this? Or anything you want me to explain further? Anything you not sure about?
Yes, Mark. You said how do you distinguish between a description? You said in the last 3 paragraphs that wasn't really talking, so he's not comparing or contrast. So you automatically know it was going to be a description. So how do we?
Right. So in these 3 paragraphs, so like I mentioned, I was kind of giving you my main idea, like I mentioned, should be changing as you're reading a passage. So you should be in your mind forming what the main idea is as you're reading it, not something you read fully and then you kind of say, oh, this is probably it. It should be changing as you're reading it and as you receive information. once I read these paragraphs, I think it's just a description because so far he's just describing. He's not necessarily kind of defending it. However, in this last paragraph, he is defending it, right? And once you get to that point, he's now praising it. In the end, his conclusion, he was trying to praise it. And that kind of changes like the whole, passage, right? Because now he was describing what it is, and now he's also saying this is like the correct way. There's no downside to this. This is kind of the best way. And he does this by saying a common criticism of contractarianism and then refuting it. And if you guys have ever in high school or college written argumentative essays, if you ever been told to write argumentative essays for an English class, they will often ask you to do this to support your argument. They'll ask you to make a counterclaim and then refute that counterclaim. And that's how you know it's an argumentative essay rather than just a descriptive essay. That's exactly what he's doing here. He has a paragraph in his argumentative essay where he introduces a counterclaim and then refutes it. All right.
Thank you.
Does that make it clear?
Yeah, so we don't necessarily need to know the difference between the verbs articulate, propose, compare, examine.
So yes, I would say you should. So articulate, what are synonyms of articulate? Well, describe, or kind of articulate, put into words, describe. It's that kind of action, right? It's not like it's not really like a defending action. It's just like a neutral action, I guess, if you want to put it. Like articulate is just describing, right? That's one part of it, and that was the first three paragraphs. And then defend is a praising kind of action. You want to, by defending something, you're kind of supporting it, you're praising it, you're kind of trying to show its merit, right? That's what it means to defend. Whereas propose, he's not really proposing a solution, so that wouldn't really be the right verb because he's not saying this is a practical solution. He's not proposing a new solution to, say, a body of government or a country or something like that. He is instead just describing and defending it, right? In a theoretical sense. Comparing is very obvious. It involves two things. And like I mentioned, I don't think he is involving two things as main idea. D, examine. Examine could be the right verb, but again, examine advantage and disadvantage is not kind of the right thing here. But yeah, so do pay attention to verbs. Verbs can be sometimes important.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other questions from anybody else? If not, I will move on. Okay. So so now we kind of have an idea of how to get the main idea, and I don't expect you guys to be able to perfectly guess it every time after just hearing one lecture or me speak about it for 10 minutes. This is unlike in physics, chemistry, biology, this is not something you can memorize. It's something that you have to learn how to do, like any skill, right? So the best way I would suggest doing this is practice. Go on Exam Crackers, go on Kaplan, go on any site that offers passages, especially CARS passages, and try and put this into action. Try and guess the main idea and see, is that something that you can accurately do every time? And what are different techniques you can try? Maybe, like I mentioned with mine, I go through it kind of paragraph by paragraph, and as I'm reading, I try and formulate a main idea, and then I would change it as I get new information as I'm reading, right? That could be one way. Maybe try other ways if that way doesn't work for you, and maybe try at the end, maybe try reading the questions first, and based on the questions, try and get like an idea of where this passage is about, right? So, but the main thing I want to like address is like there are common themes in addressing main idea. There are very common main ideas or purposes, and you should have an idea of what you're looking for as you're reading it, okay? But once you know the purpose and the main idea of the writing, the MCAT also expects you to be able to get into the minds and predict the thoughts of the author, okay? Based on how they feel on one topic, sometimes you can predict how they would feel about another. So I give you a simple example here. So say there's this author, Bob. He writes a paper in which you determine the main idea is to criticize increased funding for stem cell research based on perceived ethical concerns. You believe that the reason he's writing this paper is because he doesn't like stem cell research and he doesn't like it for ethical concerns, right? You could then infer that Bob would criticize any new technology that results from stem cell research and would praise any similar technology that uses other research methods. If he doesn't like stem cell research for ethical concerns, if, for example, there's a new drug or a new like therapy or something like new product that was released that was entirely based on stem cell research, he would also not like that product, right? And that's what I mean by inferences. You know that he doesn't like stem cell research, so you would then be able to maybe infer that he doesn't like a new product because it was based on stem cell research, right? And similarly, he would maybe praise any similar technology that uses other research methods, right? Because he doesn't like stem cell research, he would like the alternatives, right? And that's something you can infer. So an important note, in addition to the purpose, you must also look at their reasoning, why they have the opinion that they have. So for example, another author, John, writes a similar paper in which you determine the main idea is to also criticize increased funding for stem cell research, but instead of ethical concerns, he criticizes it because he believes stem cell research is a dead end and will not yield any useful results. He doesn't care about any possible ethical concerns. If he was to be shown a new technology based on stem cells that was proven to be effective, John would likely not be opposed to it, but Bob, the previous author, likely would still be opposed, right? And why is that? Well, it's because of their reasoning. Bob didn't like stem cell research because of ethical concerns. If you show him a new technology that's made on stem cell research, he still would not like the new technology because he believes it's unethical. However, John doesn't like stem cell research solely because he believes it's ineffective and inefficient. It's a dead end, right? And he believes the money could be better spent somewhere else. However, if you show him a product that's based on stem cell research that is shown to be effective, shown to be efficient, and it's not a dead end and has possible applications, he might not be opposed to it because it covers his reasoning, right? It directly ties in with his reasoning and shows that his reasoning may be flawed and it may change his mind. Whereas Bob would still not care that if it's effective, he doesn't like it for ethical reasons, right? So you want to look at not only what is the author saying, but why are they saying it? So I want to go back to the passage you guys just read. And again, it's in the Google Doc if you want to go back to it. And this is another question that kind of involves inferences, okay? I'll, again, post the link in the chat for anybody that's new. Yep, and this Google Doc would have this passage, passage 1. We'll also be doing passage 2 in a bit, okay? If you want to download it as a Word document so you can highlight and do whatever you want with it, okay? I'll give you guys a couple minutes and we'll start the poll. Okay, now take a couple more seconds. Just get your final answers in. Okay, Josh, you want to close the poll and announce the results?
Okay, so we've got the majority, 50% saying choice C, and we've got 30% saying choice D, and 20% saying choice A.
Okay, so let's go over this. So the correct answer is actually choice C, and I'm glad the majority got it. So let's go over this question together. Assume that an aged parent is being artificially kept alive, causing the family financial and emotional hardships. The passage implies that a utilitarian would most likely respond by keeping the parent alive only if doing so is beneficial to society as a whole. So let's go over why that is the right answer. Well, as we talked about, I'm going to get rid of, a second, let me just get rid of the numbers. So as we talked about, utilitarianism is only really talked about in here, right? And what does it say about it? So it says utilitarianism, which aims to calculate and institute the greatest good for the greatest number, not necessarily ruling out the possibility of sacrifice and suffering and sacrifice on the part of a minority. That's all we really get about utilitarianism. So the MCAT likely assumes that that's enough for us to make an inference of, right? So let's go back to the question and see how that relates. So keeping the parent alive only if doing so is beneficial to the society as a whole. Well, we know that they're not opposed to making sacrifices or allowing suffering for a minority if it benefits the greater good, right? It's all with utilitarianism, it's all about the greater good. If keeping the parent alive was for the greater good, then by all means keep the parent alive. Whereas if keeping the parent, not keeping the parent alive was more beneficial for society, then they would have no qualms about letting the parent die off, right? And that's why choice C is a good answer. But let's also talk about why A, B, and D are not right answers, right? A talks about balancing potential burdens on the family against burdens to society. Again, utilitarianism doesn't really want to place any burdens on society. It actually wants to make, it wants to remove any burdens from society, even if that means letting somebody die or letting somebody suffer or whatever. So it doesn't want to balance potential burdens. It wants to keep the burden on the family rather than balance the burdens from the family onto society. It doesn't want any burdens on society. That's the whole point, right? It wants society to prosper, even if one family or one small group has to bear a lot of the burden or the struggle, okay? So I don't think A is the right answer. B, arguing that the parent, as a member of the contracting unit, had an equal voice and decision. This you can mark off right away as wrong because utilitarianism has nothing to do with contracting unit. That's only in contractarianism. That has nothing to do with utilitarianism. So that you can mark off right away. D, upholding the parent's right to life against any potential lessening of the family's hardship. Again, utilitarianism, the only thing we saw about it is that they are okay with sacrifice and suffering. Therefore, they don't really care about the parent's right to life. They are willing to let the parent die if it means lessening of the family's hardship. If the family, which maybe constitutes 5 people, will live better if that one person dies, well, then that's the way it will be, right? Because the greater good, more people will benefit if the parent dies. They don't want to uphold the parent's right to life if it means other people will suffer, more people will suffer. Does this make sense to everybody? Any questions by the way?
I had a quick question about the wording of C. So when it says beneficial to society as a whole, how do you interpret as a whole? Because for me, I was thinking that that means that all of society would be benefited, but utilitarianism really cares about the majority of society, right? Not necessarily every single person. So that's how I was interpreting as a whole. So I was wondering if you could speak on that a little bit.
I see. So that's a little bit, I see what you're saying. And that's a little bit, I think, like kind of too, you're thinking about it too much in a way. So utilitarianism does focus on the greater good for the most number of people. And that's really what they consider society as a whole. So if the net gain for a lot of people is like, if for a lot of people, it's a net gain, even for a couple people, it's a net loss. As a whole in society, as like a unit, it'll be a net gain, right? And that's what they mean. So as a society, even if the death causes suffering for not only the parent, but maybe a couple of members of the family or something else, they'll take like a loss, but society as a whole, or the rest of society, will net gain. And because a lot of people gain, only a couple people lost, the system of society, the society as a whole, will gain. Does that make sense? Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? So how do we distinguish between making inference and bringing in outside info? Think, what did they tell you? Well, inferences kind of does involve a little bit of outside info. It involves like rationalizing skills. So a little bit of outside info, but like nothing specific about the topic, that makes sense. So think about what they gave you, right? About utilitarianism, and I'll go back. And like I mentioned, they gave you very little about it. So you have to think in your mind, am I assuming that something is true that the article or the question didn't specifically say? Well, if so, then it might not be. So sometimes it's hard to say, because also sometimes you do have to make some leaps, and that's like the whole point. You have to make inferences, leaps in like reasoning. You have to get from point A to point B somehow, right? So you do have to use a little bit of outside knowledge, but it's mostly, can you get where you got just based on the info they gave you? That's what you have to think about. And they gave you that greatest good for the greatest number, possibility of sacrifice and suffering on the part of the minority. And that's what you have to work with. And if you see getting this answer choice, keeping the parent alive only if doing so is beneficial to society as a whole, for the greater good, not necessarily ruling out suffering and sacrifice. Yes, like Janelle mentioned also in the chat, try not to bring in any outside info on a topic that didn't specifically mention. Sometimes this could be hard, but yeah, it helps. This is one of the ways I would say, like, if you don't know like anything about what they're talking about, it actually does help a little bit, because you can't bring outside info because you don't know any outside info. But yeah.
Thanks for explaining. So Mark, you remember that slide you had on the something, where it's a book, a theory, an idea, mixture of book, technology, all of that. How much seconds do we have you gave us 10 minutes to read the passage. I'm not sure how much minutes we'd be allowed to answer the question. When do we make these determination, whether it's a
as you're reading it the first time? So I would say, so I gave you 10 minutes to read the passage and also a couple minutes to answer the questions. Actually, on the MCAT, it's 10 minutes to read and answer all the questions associated with the passage. So I gave you a little more time. You should probably be, at least, what is this? Something you should be identifying within the first minute or two. This passage with the comment, is the author trying to praise? That's something you would probably get once you finish the passage, possibly once you start the questions, possibly. But I would say try and have it by the time you finish reading the passage the first time. And then, because I usually read the passage quickly the first time, and then when a question asks me to go back to the passage, I always go back to the passage to where it was found in the passage, right?
So it's a mental assessment, not necessarily me physically saying, oh, this looks like a technology passage, or oh, this looks like a, let's see, what else we have, a criticism. So
yeah, that's actually exactly how I think about it. As I'm reading this, I'm like, okay, so if I two concepts of social philosophy or utilitarianism, and oh, well, this is a philosophy thing. Okay. they're talking about utilitarianism and contractarianism. Okay, I've heard about these words before. Okay, and then I finish first paragraph, and then maybe I'm thinking about it's a compare contrast. But I already know what the thing is, and it's at least contractarianism and possibly utilitarianism, but it's these two philosophical ideas, right? I already know what this thing is. I think at least have an idea. And then, yeah. And then once I get to like more and I say, okay, they're not comparing, contrasting, they're more describing. Oh, well, they're also defending and praising and doing all this. But from the first paragraph, I already have an idea. This is a philosophy thing specifically about these two philosophical ideas. And this is how you usually will figure it out, right?
And my last thing is, you see how you just got the two main ideas or two main concepts being discussed, utilitarianism and contractualism. So the point is not to get caught up in the minutia of look at these not hyphenated, these yeah. What are
yes, exactly. Like all of these words are yeah. Like Bentham Locke, not needed. 1971 publication, not really necessary. John Rawls, you don't really need to know his name. Theory of Justice, you don't need to know the name of the book. All of this stuff is not on a first read. You don't really need to know it. When they ask you about it, like in here, they asked about John Rawls. Well, who is Rawls and Rawls' theory? Well, now you can go back and you easily can find it when you see the question. But on a first read, you don't need to know all of the dates, names, titles, whatever.
So what I'm saying, it's okay not to, when you're not understanding these terminologies like veil of, could you just put it back up? Let me see.
Yeah, like
you know how they had the coded words, veil of ignorance, and I'm like, what are they talking about? Just keep going on, just keep.
Yeah, try and understand as much as you can on a first read, and then come back if needed. Once you have the whole picture, maybe certain sentences will make more sense when you already have the whole picture.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Please feel free if you have any other questions in the chat. All right. Next, I want to talk about drawing conclusions. So if you're given details, they also expect you to draw conclusions from them. To do this, you must understand what those details mean. You have to break down the sentence or sentences that you're asked about and really understand what the implication of each one is. So again, just like with cars, but especially for this, something that's hard to teach and is best improved through practice. And it involves a lot of reasoning through each option, thinking critically, making some leaps when necessary, right? I really kind of want to give you an example of what I mean by this. So they gave you some details about utilitarianism and contractarianism, and they want you to make some kind of inference from the passage, right? And this is a little bit different from making an inference about a person or trying to understand a person. This is more from a detail. So let's see if you guys can do this. And this is going to be the last question, I think, for that passage, and then we'll move on to passage 2, which has, I think, less questions actually. So moving pretty quickly through it. Start up the poll. We'll start up the poll, and I'll give you guys a couple minutes, minute or two. Okay, please take last couple of seconds and then we'll end the poll. All right. Janelle, again, if you want to end the poll and announce the results.
Okay, so we've got 56% saying D, 33% saying C, and 11% saying B.
Okay, so the correct answer is D, and I'm happy that most people got it. And I'm happy most people didn't choose A, which I would think would be the trap answer, because they did mention that they are contradicting, or I think, let me get the exact wording. These two concepts are contrasting, but not necessarily contradictory. So I'm glad that people didn't get trapped in by that. So let's talk about why it's D. So involve differing notions of the desirable society. So we know that utilitarianism, a utilitarian society is one in which most people are prospering with a select group of people suffering. So maybe think of slavery, kind of piling on like misfortune onto the like poor or a certain small group of people, and they are suffering, but in exchange, the majority of people are having a good time and prospering, right? Whereas in contractarianism, like they mentioned, most people enjoy the most amount of liberty possible for everybody to have, and it's a relatively equal amount of liberty. So they're two completely different societies, a contractarian society and a utilitarian society. So their ideal goal for the society, as you can see, is very different. They both want a prospering society, but what that means is completely different for each of them. One wants a society in which everybody has equal amounts of liberty, even if that means people aren't having the best lives possible. But if they're all relatively equal lives, that's the best case scenario. Whereas contractarianism wants the majority of people have the best lives possible, even if it means a small group has to have the worst lives possible. So completely different societies that they are striving towards. Start from similar ideas of human nature. I wouldn't say this. I think this, out of the other answers, this is the closest one, and that's why I got the most votes, but I do think it's not exactly right. So I think they do start from different ideas of human nature. So like, and this is one where you really have to do, let me get rid of the numbers, so it's just kind of distracting. This is one where you do have to do like a little bit of inference and kind of like reasoning. So in order for a contractarianism society to work, humans have to not be greedy. And this is how they, this is what he talked about here, might well decide to gamble on the outcome of the social order. Again, like people can be greedy, people can gamble or stuff like that, but generally contractarianism relies on the fact that people are acting in kind of, I guess, their own self-interest in a way, right? Or by like not being too greedy, and where it's possible for them to also be in the bad position. So they want to have like a decent position for themselves. Whereas utilitarianism doesn't really have that. It really kind of sees man as more chaotic and in need of like control, I guess, in a way. And they kind of talk about that a little bit here and a little bit in here, right? But this is one that they kind of, they don't start from the same position, right? So they have like different ideas about what human nature really is. One kind of thinks humans are kind of like naturally like self-serving and kind of like orderly, whereas other thinks they're more chaotic and need to be controlled. They agree on several major points. That would be outside information. B would be outside information. They don't mention any points that they agree on. So I would say B is incorrect, and A conflict with each other. And nobody picked this, and I'm glad. they specifically said they're contrasting, but not necessarily contradictory. Yeah. Opal mentioned that, yeah. So yeah, that was a coincidence. I didn't mean to do that. And
hey, Mark, quick question. So the last two questions, I've narrowed it down to the two correct answer choices, and I always choose the one that's incorrect. I've always managed to get rid of the bad two ones, and then somehow choose the next bad one. And it's just as bad as if you didn't really know. So it makes one answer choice much better than the other because.
So again, it depends on from question to question, obviously, but really kind of find ways you can, when it comes down to that, that's already a good start. It's unlucky that you've gotten it, but 2 is a small sample size. There's 60 questions. So 2 is a very small sample size. So at least the 50-50 is much better than the 25%. But we do obviously want you doing better, like getting consistently more right. So I would say try, and once you've narrowed down to 2, try to eliminate, see if you have, based on the passage, any rebuttals against any of them, anything in the passage that could possibly disprove either one of them. If you can't find anything that really disproves one of them, then that's probably the correct answer, right? So like, again, start from similar ideas of human nature. That one's a little bit more iffy, and there's a lot more that you could really like, kind of like hits you could get against it, where it's like contractarianism really is, human nature is kind of more orderly and more rational, whereas utilitarianism, people don't really know what's necessarily good for them, and they'll be in their own interest. So we have to kind of do what's best for the most people, like ourselves. So that's kind of like you can make hits against C, whereas D, you can't really find anything in the passage that would disprove it. So that's why it would be a better answer choice, I think. Sometimes you really do have to gamble and go for 50-50s. I know I did a couple of times as well, both in the practice test and on the real test as well. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. You kind of have to take the hits where you get them. You don't need a perfect, you don't need to get every single question right in order to get a perfect score. I most likely didn't. Most likely got a couple wrong, but you don't need it, every question right to get a perfect score. So sometimes you can, but again, try and find anything you could use against any one of the answer choices and see which one there's less evidence against. Does that make sense?
Yes, and again, you said the word practice, so it will come with practice. Me making
exactly.
Narrowing it down to 50 and still getting it wrong is same as me narrowing it down to 1 out of 20. 1 out of 4. Wrong is wrong. You know what I'm saying? I'm not gonna.
So I don't. So in terms of on the real test, yes, but in terms of practice, no, because if 1 out of 20. That means you had completely no idea what you're doing, and you can't, how do you build up from that? It's like a long way to build up. Whereas 1 out of 50, first, it's more likely that next time you'll get it right. If you consistently narrow down to 50-50, there's more chance you get it right. And it's easier to improve upon. It's easier to kind of like take that one step up. Yeah, so on the real test, yes, but in practice, no. Okay. Next, and this is if you've taken any practice tests, you'll have encountered these types of questions: strengthen, weaken. Once you understand the main idea of anything, whether it be the whole passage or maybe it could be just one paragraph in the passage. So they may ask you what is the main idea of the passage as a whole, or they may actually ask you what is the main idea of paragraph 3, paragraph 4, paragraph 5 of the passage, right? And you have to kind of essentially just scale it down, do exactly what you do for the whole passage and just scale it down to on a one passage level, on one paragraph level. Normally after each question, I believe there's 5 to 6. I believe some passages have 5, some have 6 after each passage. But yeah, so again, doing a paragraph faster, same thing, similar. What they may, and then once you have the main idea, you should have an idea of how to strengthen or weaken that idea with evidence, right? You should have an idea of what evidence would support it and what evidence would disprove whatever that idea is, right? There's many forms of support or opposition that include but are not limited to statistical research, specific examples, new findings, etc. So statistical research could be something like 40% of people who do this this exercise live 10 years longer. That's a statistic or whatever. That's one way to support whatever exercise you are kind of peddling. Specific examples, maybe it could be if you're trying to support, say, utilitarianism or contractarianism, say societies that, like, there's this society in history and this society in history that have used very similar models to contractarianism or utilitarianism, and they have prospered very greatly because of it. And you just specifically point to like specific nations or specific civilizations in history that have used what you've done and they've like prospered or something like that. A new finding could be like any kind of scientific evidence, kind of ties into statistical research, except this is more, statistical research doesn't necessarily have to be scientific. It could be just percent of people and could just be a fact, whereas a finding is necessarily kind of like a causation. I don't want to get too much into that, but statistics is more like a fact, like 50% of people who smoke die sooner or something like that. I don't know, and finding could be that it is a specific thing in cigarettes that leads to death, something like that. I don't know. You must determine what the significance of each of these points of evidence means. How does it relate to the main idea? Does it support the main idea? Does it go against the main idea? How does it work with the main idea? Okay. For example, I want to go back to the author John, who wrote about stem cell research and its lack of efficacy. If you were told that no new technology in the last 30 years was based on stem cell research, how would that relate to the main idea of John's paper? Since the research has not led to any innovations for a very long time, well, the answer is, since the research has not led to any innovations for a very long time, you can logically reason that the research is not very effective, right? If you're doing research for 30 years and you get no answers, it's probably not necessarily good research. This would be in line with John's opinion, who argued that stem cell research is a dead end, you're not going to get anything out of it, and he would support it because it's in line with it. And it would thus be a detail that would strengthen his claim, so he could use that as evidence, right? On the contrary, if over 10 different new approved drugs released in the 5 years were based on stem cell research, we could logically conclude that the research is effective, and that would weaken John's claim. Again, if he claims that stem cell research is not effective, it's a dead end, it's a waste of money, but then we have this finding or the statistic that over 10 new drugs released in the 5 years are based on this research, we could say, we would know that, well, this research is effective, therefore his claim is wrong, and this weakens his main idea. This goes against his main idea. Okay, that's very simple and all that. But let's put this into practice again, and let's combine all the things we've learned so far. Let's try and put in practice. This is passage 2 on your on the Google Doc, which I'll put in one last time in the chat for anybody that's new. Otherwise, please start reading. I'll give you guys again 10 minutes. Yep, I'll give you guys 10 minutes. And there's less questions on after this one, and we're almost done. Okay, please start reading. Okay. I actually want to make it a little bit more realistic. So does anybody need more time? So this is like realistically how much time you would spend, maybe even a little bit less on reading the actual passage, okay? And now try and spend about a minute or so on the question. So you guys have spent, just for if you're tracking yourselves, you've spent 5 minutes on the passage so far if you stopped when I told you to. And now if you had 5 questions, a minute on each one. We'll try and do a minute on this one. So poll should be up, please. Please take yeah, a couple more seconds and then we'll close the poll. Get your answers in if you haven't already.
Okay, so we have 44% saying choice C. And then 33% saying choice A. And then 22% saying choice D.
Okay. Well, all right. So the correct answer actually is choice D. And let's go over this because, yeah. So which of the following evolutionary explanations for the existence of altruism in humans, if true, would pose the greatest challenge to the selfish gene theory? Essentially, this is a strength and weakness question with just different wording. So it's asking which of these, if true, would most weaken the selfish gene theory? For this, you need to know what the selfish gene theory indicates. Well, we know from the passage that it involves genes. If they have some kind of benefit, they will be passed on. If they benefit themselves, at least. If they benefit themselves, they will be passed on. If they do not benefit themselves, if it does not benefit themselves, they will not be passed on, right? Altruism is a little bit of a contradiction to that. However, there are ways that in which altruism essentially makes you a decrease in fitness sometimes. Altruism is essentially always a decrease in fitness, but there are certain cases in which, as a result of that decrease, you actually increase fitness because of a different factor, right? And that increase would make it more beneficial to pass on the trait, and that's how altruism would get passed on. how would we weaken that claim, right? So we would have to go against it. If we went against it, that means something is a decrease, but it doesn't have that compensation to make it go up in order for it to get passed down. It's just a decrease with no compensation and no increase, but it still gets passed on for some reason, right? That's how we would weaken something. Now let's look at the answer choices. Let's go with the most popular choice of choice C. Humans have developed a keen sense for recognizing individuals who fail to do their fair share and a strong inclination to ostracize these freeloaders, decreasing their fitness. Right, so let's look at these two different groups. This group is altruistic, this group is not altruistic. This altruistic group, and the bar represents their fitness level. The altruistic group takes a hit because they're altruistic. Altruism is always a small hit. But if society sees that this group is not altruistic and they're freeloaders, that would also decrease their fitness and they would also take a hit. And now you notice this group is actually lower than this altruistic group. So now which of these is high, whichever of these genes is higher, that's the one that's going to get passed on and the other's not. Altruism is going to get passed on. At least according to the selfish gene theory, the one that's higher is going to get passed on. In this case, altruism gets passed on and then that works out, right? So C can't be the correct answer because it completely agrees with the selfish gene theory. Let's talk about A. Humans primarily help close relatives and do so because they share genes with these individuals, which compensates for any disadvantage occurred. Again, two genes, altruism, always a hit, goes down, and fitness. But if you help your relatives and your relatives mate and reproduce and pass on their genes, that's actually a compensation that benefits in this. And even though it was an initial hit, it gets overcompensated. And now the altruistic gene is now higher than the non-altruistic gene in terms of favorability. So according to the selfish gene theory, the one that's more favorable will get passed on, whereas the one that's less favorable will not get passed on. This one is more favorable and this one gets passed on. So that's perfect accordance to the selfish gene theory. That checks out. Let's look at D. Human societies which contain many altruistic individuals are able to outcompete those societies which contain many selfish, leading to predominance of altruistic cultures. Well, again, let's look at this. Altruistic and selfish. Altruism, always a hit, goes here. But the question did not mention a specific compensation or anything like that, right? Doesn't mention any explanations, doesn't measure any compensations, none of that. So we just assume this is how it is in terms of fitness. But the question did say that this gene got passed down the most, right? The one on the left, even though the selfish gene theory says that the one that has a higher bar was more likely to get passed on, or that will get passed on. But this one says, the answer choice says that this one got passed on, the lower one. Well, that goes against what the selfish gene theory says. And if it was true, it would most weaken the selfish gene theory because it's a fact that's directly opposing the theory. So in that sense, D would be the correct answer. And B, again, humans engage in altruistic behavior when there's others to see. It increases social status. Again, two genes, altruism's initial hit, but increases social status, which increases fitness, goes up. Again, this one will get passed on selfish gene theory, as selfish gene theory says. So it follows. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody have any questions or anything that they want to talk about?
So we're looking for something that challenge an opposition. So this is where I get confused because then that's that negative that I hate so much. We're challenging an opposition, that's like agreeing, so.
No, it only has one negative. So which of the following would pose the greatest challenge? I said I use the word opposition as a substitute for the word challenge, so it's a synonym. So challenge, oppose, contradict, whatever you want to use, there's only one, right? Would pose the greatest challenge to selfish gene theory. So which would oppose it, which would contradict it, essentially like that. Which one opposes it? And
so this was not a double negative. This was literally
one negative, yeah.
Which one was the opposite of what? Okay.
Exactly.
I think I was reading.
And weaken is also a synonym for challenge. greatest challenge is weaken, contradict. All of these are synonyms. They basically the same question. Okay, any other questions about this before we move on to another question? Okay, please take 1 more minute. I believe this is the last question. There may be one more, but please take a minute for this question. Polls should be going up right about now. Okay. And if it maybe helps you, this is a little bit of a strength and weakness question, but it's mostly an inference question. So think about it through that lens if that might help you. Okay, I'm going to stop the poll in a second, so please get your answers in if you have not already. Okay, all right, Jill, if you would stop the poll and share the results.
Okay, so we've got 67% saying choice B. And 22% saying choice C. And 11% saying choice A.
Okay, so I'm happy that this was chosen because the correct answer is choice B. Okay, and I will go over this. So which of the following acts of altruism is least plausibly explained by one of the theories in the passage? So this was just using details. Give it this second. So they mentioned a couple of exceptions in the passage. So altruism, they said it's normal negative, but how does this work? So partial is kin selection. So if you're helping your family. Another hypothesis is if my reciprocal altruism, which is if I help someone, they'll help me. And then this last one here is costly signaling this. So these were the three. So kin selection says you want to help your family. You may be altruistic to your family because they share your genes. Reciprocal altruism is you're taking a hit to help somebody in the hopes that tomorrow they'll help you, and that'll give you more positive. And costly signaling is when you have so much excess that you give up some of yours without any benefit, with the benefit actually being that people are there to see it and appreciate it. And as a result, you profit off of people just seeing it. Like you get kind of recognition, right? So let's look back at our answer choices. Let's go to the answer choices. So A, a soldier jumps on a live grenade. And by the way, this is which is least explained. So which of these is not explained? Soldier jumps on a grenade, injuring himself but saving the others of his company. This would this could relate to costly signaling. He hurt himself, but as a result, he may be called like a war hero or just a hero in general, and people will like him for that reason because he's a hero. It could also be reciprocal altruism. If he does this, then maybe his other members of his company, next time they're in a battle or something, they may do the same for him, right? Because they appreciate what he's done, right? Or they may help him in some other way in whatever he's done because he saved them, right? So he may get benefit off in that way. I'm going to skip B for now. C, a filmmaker creates a documentary in a war zone to raise awareness of the plight of suffering children. Again, he's being altruistic, but his name's going to be attached to the movie. He's going to have press and media about him and for making this movie, and then people are going to think he is a happy and like caring and kind person who is doing all of this to raise awareness, and they will like him more for it, right? And that's also explained by costly signaling. A homeless man pushed a stranger out of the way of an oncoming bus. Again, this could be costly signaling because or it could be, it's most likely reciprocal because he hopes that the man will then help him, or somebody else who has seen this will help the homeless man by offering him some kind of reward. Or it could be that people just see this homeless man do this and they will think better of him and they may do something for him in exchange, right? However, B, a businesswoman donates half her wealth to charity, but on the condition that her identity not be revealed. Well, this doesn't fall under kin selection. This doesn't, because it's not family. It doesn't fall under costly signaling because nobody knows it's her that's making the donations, right? So her name is not attached to the donation to the altruism, just like it would be for the filmmaker or the soldier or the homeless man, right? It's anonymous. So it wouldn't fall under cost signaling, and it wouldn't fall under reciprocal altruism because, again, it's anonymous. The people who are receiving the charity don't know that it's coming from her, so they can't possibly help her in the future if she ever needs help with anything because they don't know it was her. So that would be the only situation which would not be plausibly explained by one of the theories. So this is just using details that were mentioned in the passage. Does anybody have any questions about this before I move on to my final thoughts? If not, I will move on. Okay, final thoughts. So a key takeaway from today is that the cars section is not based on your previous knowledge, but rather your ability to think and reason about the information you're given. Again, you could theoretically walk into cars not knowing anything about biophysics, chemistry, philosophy, psychology, whatever, and still score a 132, a perfect score, right? As long as you can think and reason the way the MCAT wants you to. The answers to each of the questions are given to you in the passage. You simply need to learn how to find them. This is not exactly true because sometimes you do have to make inferences and reach conclusions that are not specifically stated, but you should be able to make those inferences and conclusions based on the information in the passage. You shouldn't be relying on outside information. So in that sense, it is true. The best way to learn to reason and think the way the MCAT wants you to do is to practice. Struggle with cars, keep practicing, and make sure when you practice, keep the things I mentioned in mind. Also, be thinking about the important question: why is he writing this? What is he trying to apply? What does it logically mean? all of these things you should be thinking about while you're reading, right? Not just after, when you come to a question, like especially the why is he writing this? What is he trying to imply with this? You should be thinking that while you're reading. That will help you just understand the passage better, right? If you understand paragraph 1 or why he's writing paragraph 1, you'll have an easier time understanding paragraph 2. If you don't really understand what paragraph 1 is about, reading paragraph 2 is just going to compound the confusion and just going to make it hard for you to understand what's going on at all, right? So as you're reading, try and understand what's actually happening, what's being said, why is it being said. Okay. And do this both when you're reading the passage and when you're reading the answer choices for each question, especially for the strength and weaken questions. For the strength and weaken questions, if they ask you about details, think for each answer choice, if this was true, what would this mean for the passage? How does this relate to the passage? Would this support the argument? Would it not support it? So you have to be thinking about it when you're reading answers as well. There's not one, and it's not written here, but there's not just one way to approach cards. People have different strategies. I tend to read the passage first to get a general idea, and then go read the question and go back to the passage. Some people I know like reading the questions first to get a sense of what they're actually looking for in the passage, and then read the passage. Find your own way. Try out different ways if you're struggling. If one way is not working for you, try out different ways. Maybe they work better, maybe they don't. Find the way that works best for you. Again, the only way to do that is if you do more passages, more practice. Okay. When you're practicing, make sure when you are reviewing something that you got wrong, make sure you understand what part of the process you're not getting. So, for example, if you got a question wrong, did you get the question wrong because you didn't understand what the main idea of the passage was, and then you just couldn't work from there, right? If it was an inference question that required you to know the main idea, did you struggle in figuring out the main ideas in the first place, and that's why you couldn't infer from that? Or did you correctly guess the main idea, but then you didn't make the right inference, right? And that's where you struggled. So, and then from there, you can work on whatever it is you're struggling with, whichever step of the process, essentially, right? So when you're reviewing, exactly see what types of questions you're getting wrong. Are they strength and weaken, inference, main idea, whatever, and what part of the process is problematic for you, right? And then try and specifically work on that, find tips. Feel free to come to office hours and ask me tips on specific steps, or not just me, Janelle, or any of the other tutors as well. But feel free to ask us, or feel free to go online, to email us, to ask in the group me for maybe some of the other students have any suggestions, all of that. Any other questions? So the main idea is, so this is what I was getting at. The main idea is not in a paragraph. The main idea is in every paragraph. That's why it's the main idea. Hints of the main idea should be in all of the paragraphs, and then you have to combine them into one main idea. The main idea of paragraph 1 is just the idea that's present in that one paragraph, and it relates to the main idea of the passage, right? So yes, there are a lot of things to consider with main idea. You mentioned tone. That is definitely, tone and language is definitely one thing that you want to talk about. Is it, when they're talking about a topic, are they talking about it with like good tone, good language, positive language? Whereas another topic, they're talking about like negative language and negative tone. Well, then it's probably they're comparing and they like one over the other, right? Focus on what they're talking the most about, which subject. So for example, in contractarian utilitarianism, they did talk about utilitarianism, but they didn't talk about it the most. They talked the most about just contractarianism. So focus on that. Same thing with like, and I've seen this, people get tripped up with this. If they talk about a person, say like a political figure or something, and then they talk about his ideas or one of his ideas or one of his theories or one of his policies or something like that, are they specifically focusing more on the political figure or on the person himself? Or are they focusing more on his idea or his policy or that one specific thing he did? Which is the main idea? Which do they talk more about? Because obviously they have to talk about both. They can't just introduce an idea without giving the name of the person who gave the idea. But do they talk more about the idea than they do about the person, or do they talk about more about the person and this was just one of the things he did? Think about that. Yeah. So, and like Janelle mentioned, they will introduce an idea in the first paragraph, and they usually will, at least in some form, at like an introduction. So like, think about it also when you're writing an essay. If you're writing an argumentative essay, obviously your argument is going to be in every single paragraph, right? That's why your paragraph's there. If your paragraph doesn't relate to your argument, why did you have that paragraph in there in the first place, right? And think about that in that context as well. If like they wrote that paragraph in there for a reason, and it's because it relates to the main idea. So you just have to see what is the common theme.
Yeah, Mark, but I don't know. I think I misquote. I thought I heard you said early on that if, especially with the Darwin example, if they're mentioned in his book and not his life, stay away from answer choices that are about his life. Did I misquote you?
No, okay, so that's no, and that's exactly what I was talking about right now. So they obviously they can't mention Darwin's book without talking about who Darwin was, right? That's how they're not just gonna randomly drop his book. But do they talk more like throughout the whole? They're obviously gonna mention both in the first paragraph, the book and the life. Throughout the whole essay, do they talk more about his book or do they talk more about his life, right? If the whole essay is about his book, then the main idea is about his book, not himself. It doesn't matter who he is; it's about his book. If the whole essay is about his life, and they just mentioned the book in the first paragraph as one of the things he did, and then in the second paragraph they mention a different book or a different theory, and in the third paragraph they mention a different book and a different theory that he had, then they're talking about him as a person, his life, right? So you have to think, which are they talking more about? One, like his theory, or him as a person?
Okay, this question is thank you, for Janelle. I know you said not to be caught up with the main idea may not be in the first paragraph. So if I was reading a passage on Grecian art and the historicity of it and how medieval and all these language, and by the second paragraph, it gets worse because then they start talking about the Greco-Roman influence on Grecian art. Okay, and so I'm still waiting for the language that I'm able to understand. So by paragraph 3, what happens? Do I just, I'm like, I'm not getting any, at what point do I say I'm still not getting the main idea and like try to go back to the first paragraph, wasting time, or just plowing through to language that makes sense at some point? What do I do with those hard, difficult? I'm matter of fact, I might have that passage for you tomorrow too. That is how it was terrible.
Oh, well, I guess because it does waste time to go back to the previous sentences. So I would say if you can just keep trying to push on. But I'm just curious, like, I guess, was it like completely the whole passage? I mean, the whole paragraph for the first two that you completely didn't understand, but were there just certain sentences within those paragraphs?
No, the language literally started making sense at the very last paragraph. So they wanted to talk about the Greco-Roman influence on Grecian art, and they went into all this historicity, right? And they kept on with it all 4 paragraphs. And then the author was just like, well, this is what I think of all this nonsense. And I'm like, exactly, author. I think it's not also. So he and I were agreeing. So again, it took me 4 paragraphs to realize that the author is, I don't know. Yeah. So if just way above my head, I did push through. I did not go back. And then finally, it started making sense what the author's main point was literally in the last paragraph. So what Mark said about try to understand the first, because after the second, if you don't understand the first, it gets crazy. No, the first, second, third, and fourth was crazy, and it only made sense in the fourth. What do we do? How do we reconcile that Mark, what Mark just said with, I don't know.
I mean, I guess different people have different opinions on how to go about this, so I'll give my 2 cents on it, I guess. I would encourage you to push through, kind of like you did. Usually, if the questions, are directed to certain paragraphs, they might mention that in the question itself, so you will know exactly which paragraph to go to. If not, at least my other method was sometimes when I would have these passages that I'm not really sure about some terms, I'll kind of like put, on my sheet, because you are allowed like a sheet that they give you on the MCAT. I'll put like paragraph 1 and then maybe like this certain term. I'll just jot down a word or something that kind of reminds me of like vaguely what that paragraph was about. So if they are to mention that in a question again later, then I also know that that's a paragraph that I could look more into.
Okay, so just maybe one word from those, from that complex language. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Thank you.
And
yep, hopefully that helped.
yeah, and I want to give a quick like my thoughts on it. So it seems like to me like you answered your own question in a sense. Like, what would I do? Well, I would say you did the right thing. Finish the passage, see if it makes sense. If you read the whole passage, you have absolutely no idea what you read, like from start to finish, you have no idea what's going on, skip it, go to the next one, come back to it later. That would be my advice. But you mentioned in the last paragraph, it did start to make sense. And that's kind of like what I think is important, because in the last paragraph, he was talking about how Greco-Roman art inspired Grecian art, right? Well, now you have an idea of you have some idea of what the topic was. And then when you look at the questions and they direct you, like Janelle said, back to paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, you are coming into those paragraphs with already the idea that, okay, I know Greco-Roman, he wants to say that Greco-Roman art influenced this, or if you said he disagrees with that, like he maybe disagrees with that theory or whatever. But you're coming in there with the idea already, and I think it'll help you in that sense, right? So push through, finish the whole passage. If you have no idea, skip it. You've already read it once, so when you come back to it at the end, maybe it'll make more sense. Give it some time. I don't know, with age comes wisdom. You're an hour older, so maybe you're an hour wiser. But other than that, like, if it does make sense, like you said, in the end, like, try and see if you can answer any of the questions. Even if you get 1 or 2 of the questions right and you know them, that's still, I would say, a worth use of your time, unless you're struggling very hard with time in the cars section, in which case maybe not worth it. But normally I think even 1 or 2 questions is important.
Yeah, since I'm not finishing, I just do C's. So I know I'll have to go back to that passage. And like you said, since I'm never finishing, I just choose C's and just move on to a simpler one and hope.
Exactly. Sometimes take the loss on one of the passages and move on. The hardest passage for me, and you were talking about this, and I know exactly how you feel. The art stuff, the cinema, the theater, all of that stuff made no sense to me. It was definitely a struggle, like finding like any clues I can throughout the passage. What the hell is this guy's talking about with this art stuff, to kind of like piece it together. But yeah, like I had usually a lot of time left, so I could afford to do that and like find like any word or a sentence that I might understand and to kind of like puzzle it together. But if you don't have the time, it's not worth it. Do the ones you can kind of do like the philosophy or the psychology or the history or the whatever ones that you have a slightly better understanding of. And in this sense, it definitely helps to be a kind of like more well-rounded person in that sense, in that you've taken philosophy and history and poetry, literature classes before, and you kind of have good variety of topics, because even though you can't use outside information, having outside information similar to a topic that they're writing about will help you understand what it is. Like, I don't know anything about art or theater or anything like that, and those are the passages I struggled the most on. I have a pretty good understanding of background in history and a little bit in philosophy, so those were always the easiest for me. And at least to understand, just to understand what's going on in the passage, what they're trying to say. And once you can understand the passage, answering the questions becomes a whole lot easier. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. Yeah, again, it's too late to change what you know now. You're not going to learn all of art, history, and philosophy in a month, in addition to what you're studying. So play to what you already know and what you can already understand. All right. Any other questions from anybody before we wrap up? Okay. So that seems like it. Thank you guys for joining us today. Don't forget office hours are tomorrow if you would like to join us. Otherwise, lecture next Thursday. All right. See you guys then.
See you. Take care, guys.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone. Good night.